Elena Chambers set her mother's brass key on the sill above the washstand and did not touch it again. It gleamed there in the candlelight like an accusation, too polished for the narrow room she had rented with her last 10 sovereigns, and too heavy for a lock she no longer meant to open. The wallpaper had lifted from the damp in 2 corners, and the hearth drew badly, so coal smoke settled low before it climbed. Her carpet-bag stood at the foot of the bed, still half-packed, because unpacking implied permanence, and permanence required a degree of certainty she did not yet possess. She threaded her needle, bent over a length of plum silk from the milliner's work-basket, and stitched buttonhole after buttonhole until the pad of her thumb went numb. By the time the church bell marked 5, the candle had guttered to a shallow cup of wax. She pinched the flame dead, wrapped her shawl close, and carried her pail down 2 flights of stairs to the pump in the courtyard. Hawthorne Row woke in increments, a kitchen door opening, a cough behind thin plaster, the rattling wheel of the baker's cart at the far end of the lane. Tenants stood in a line that shifted by habit rather than courtesy. No one greeted anyone before daylight. Mrs. Pike from the attic glanced once at Eleanor's boots, then at her hands, pale and careful even after a week of needlework. "You are the lady from Kensington," she said, with no malice and no softness either. "The one who left." Elena kept her place when the line shuffled forward. "I am Miss Chambers from number 12, she said. Mrs. Pike gave a short nod, as if a correction had been requested and granted only in part. "The steward says you are late on coal already." "I paid yesterday." "He says his ledger disagrees." The pump handle groaned when Eleanor put her weight on it. Water came in a hard, cold arc. She filled her pail and stepped aside without answering. In this street, the steward's ledger carried the authority of Scripture, and argument with Scripture never ended in victory for the person without money. When she climbed back to her room, her forearm burned from the weight of water, and her breath plumed white in the corridor. A folded envelope lay on her threshold, cream stock with a black edge, and her full name written in her mother's narrow hand. Miss Elena Chambers, Hawthorne Row. No one in the building used paper that fine. No one in the building had a footman to send. She took it inside, closed the door, and stood for a moment, with the letter unopened, listening to the sounds on the landing. A latch clicked 2 doors down. Someone laughed, then lowered his voice. A child asked for bread and was told to wait. Life pressed on around her with practical indifference. She broke the seal. "Eleanor, return by Michaelmas. The arrangement remains final. Your refusal has been noted. Allowance suspended until compliance. Your mother, Beatrice Chambers." No flourish, no plea, no mention of affection, disappointment, or concern. Beatrice wrote as she spoke. A schedule, a condition, a consequence. Elena folded the page back along its original crease and slid it beneath the chipped porcelain tray on her washstand. Her hand trembled once at the wrist. Then it steadied. She picked up her needle again. By noon she had completed 26 buttonholes and pricked her finger twice. By 2, the sky had gone slate and rain began against the window, first as scattered taps and then in a steady sheet. She kept working until her neck tightened and her vision blurred, then took the finished cuffs downstairs to the milliner's messenger at the door. He counted quickly, paid her in coins worn nearly smooth, and left without stepping over the threshold. As she turned back toward the stair, Mr. Cresswell emerged from the steward's office carrying his account book under one arm. He was a broad man with a polished watch chain and a face that looked perpetually bored by other people's misfortune. He called after her without raising his voice. "Miss Chambers," she stopped. "You remain 2 shillings and 4 pence in arrears for coal surcharge." "I paid in full yesterday evening." His expression did not alter. You paid for last month's deficiency. This week's adjustment stands. For what adjustment? For increased fuel demand on your floor. My fire has been lit twice. He opened his ledger, ran one finger down a column, and closed it again with a small, efficient movement. The figures are accurate. Elena looked at the office door behind him, at the pegs where tenants' keys hung in labelled rows, at the stack of notices on his desk, prepared in advance, already addressed. Then your figures and my purse are unlikely to become friends, she said. For the first time, the corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile. A faint acknowledgement that insolence had been detected and filed. You may settle by Friday. He walked back into his office and shut the door before she could answer. In the stairwell, two younger tenants paused just long enough to watch her stand there. One whispered, not quietly enough, "That is the ungrateful daughter, the one who turned down a lord." The other gave a small laugh of astonished disapproval, as though declining security were a species of vanity she could not afford to admire. Elena climbed to her room without haste. Inside, she sat on the edge of the bed and untied the ribbon at her throat. Her breathing had gone shallow. She pressed her palm against the quilt until the shaking in her fingers passed. Not ungrateful, she thought. Not impractical. Cornered. The memory came with such precision that it felt present. Her mother's drawing room in Kensington, the marble mantel, the scent of orange peel from the fire. Mrs. Beatrice Chambers standing with one gloved hand on the back of a gilt chair, as if negotiating a shipment rather than her daughter's life. You will marry Lord Ashford, Beatrice had said. The arrangement is final. Elena had remained near the window, one hand on the curtain tassel, watching carriage wheels cut damp crescents into the street below. I do not know him. Acquaintance is not required. He is 42. He is solvent. There had been silence then, not theatrical, only exhausted. Beatrice had crossed to the writing desk and sorted a stack of correspondence while she spoke, each paper aligned to the edge with mathematical care. I will not indulge melodrama. Your father's trust releases quarterly allowances under co-trustee oversight. My recommendation governs continuation. You may choose comfort with duty or principle without means. Elena had said nothing. The clock on the mantel had marked 2 measured minutes. Do not mistake this for cruelty, Beatrice had added, still straightening papers. It is administration. Eleanor had walked to the hall, taken her coat from the stand, and asked the maid for her carpet bag. She had left before tea. Back in Hawthorne Row, with rain hissing against the pane, she drew the carpet bag toward her and counted what remained. Coins from the milliner, 2 folded chemises, a prayer book, her father's pocket compass that no longer pointed true, 1 cameo brooch wrapped in linen. She closed the clasp and pushed the bag under the bed again. She would not sell the cameo yet. Not yet. A knock came near dusk, brisk and official. She opened to find a hall boy holding a second envelope and trying not to stare at her room behind her shoulder. From Chambers' house, miss. She took it, gave him the smallest coin she could spare, and watched his expression flicker in disappointment before he ran downstairs. The second letter was shorter than the first. Elena, Lord Ashford dines on Thursday. Your seat remains available. If you return before then, I shall consider this lapse concluded. B. C. Elena laid both letters side by side on the washstand and looked at them until the ink blurred, then folded each into exact quarters and placed them under her Bible. She did not burn them. Evidence should be preserved when power pretended to be civility. Night settled early. Rain found the crack in the ceiling above her table and began to drip into her washbasin with irritating regularity. She moved her mending basket clear, set a second bowl beneath the leak, and resumed stitching by candlelight. Downstairs, someone argued over rent in a voice gone hoarse from repetition. A door slammed, then quiet, then footsteps again. The building breathed through timber and plaster, through the weight of people who had nowhere else to place their bodies, through privations managed one coin and one compromise at a time. Elena worked until her shoulders ached and the seam blurred, and she welcomed the ache because it was honest. It asked only endurance, never surrender. At 9:30, another sound entered the corridor outside her door. The scrape of a trunk dragged up the landing. A man's measured tread, then a pause directly opposite her room as a key turned in the long, vacant lock. A new tenant, she thought, and kept sewing. Hawthorne Row admitted arrivals with the same indifference with which it witnessed departures. Across the landing, a door opened, then closed softly, as if its owner had no wish to be heard. Elena waited until the corridor settled, then set her needle down and listened to the unfamiliar rhythm across the landing. A trunk lid lifted, hinges protesting softly, the muted thud of boots placed with care rather than dropped in haste. Not a family, then. One man alone. She pinched the bridge of her nose, blew out the candle and lay down fully clothed over the quilt, because undressing in a room that smelled of damp coal and plaster dust felt like optimism she could not afford. At dawn, she woke to the basin ringing with rainwater from the ceiling crack, and to someone below coughing in long, tearing bursts. She rolled from the bed, tied her hair back with the ribbon from yesterday, and put her hand first to the windowsill where the brass key had been in Kensington, then remembered there was no key here worth touching. The motions of the day arranged themselves without consultation. Pump line, 2 hours of buttonholes, delivery to the milliner's boy, return for account copying at the apothecary on Larch Street, then evening mending for any tenant who paid in thread or bread. By the third morning of her second week in Hawthorne Row, she could tell the time from the staircase alone. Milk cart at 6, Mrs. Pike's limping tread at past, Mr. Finch's stick at 7 when he made his careful descent to the yard for air that never helped his lungs. She took her pail down and found the courtyard already occupied. Steam from wet cobbles rose in pale twists. Mrs. Dalrymple, who let out altered gowns from the ground floor front room, stood with her arms folded inside her shawl, lips blue with cold. "You are early, Miss Chambers," she said. "I am always early when there is 1 pump and 18 tenants." Mrs. Dalrymple's mouth moved in what might have been agreement. Cresswell posted new notices at midnight. Coal supplements again. Elena worked the handle until water struck the pail in a clear arc. He has an inventive ledger. Ledger or not, we freeze together. They carried their water in silence. On the first landing, Elena paused to catch her breath and saw, by the opposite threshold, a pair of work gloves laid neatly to dry and a porter's trunk with brass corners dulled by travel. A narrow card had been slid into the doorframe, J. Vale, so that was his name. Her room held the same narrow inventory it had held yesterday, and would hold tomorrow. 1 bed with a sag to the left side, 1 chair whose cane seat had broken and been repaired with twine, 1 washstand, 1 shelf for her Bible and her father's compass, 1 basket of paid work, 1 basket of unpaid obligations she had promised herself to finish anyway. She ate yesterday's heel of bread, standing at the washstand, and copied figures from an apothecary ledger until her eyes watered. The columns steadied her. Arithmetic did not flatter, but it did not lie. Near noon she carried cuffs and collars to the milliner's messenger, who counted each piece twice, shaved 2 pence from the agreed amount, and shrugged as if prices had changed by decree of weather. She did not argue. She put the coins in her purse and walked 2 streets east to Larch Street, where the apothecary's wife had learned to trust her handwriting and her silence. Elena spent 3 hours transcribing invoices while jars of camphor and laudanum glinted in weak light, and customers came in with their hats crushed in their hands. At 4, she returned to Hawthorne Row and found Mr. Finch on the lower stair, one hand on the rail, the other searching air that offered no support. His cataracts had turned his eyes to milky blue glass, and he refused help from anyone who sounded impatient. "Mr. Finch," she said, lowering her voice so he could place her. "The 3rd step is broken at the edge. Put your cane to the right. Miss Chambers." He exhaled through his teeth and obeyed. "I have a letter from my nephew. If I ask after supper, would you read it?" "I will. Payment in walnuts." Payment accepted. She took his elbow for 2 steps and released him before pride could turn to anger. In Hawthorne Row, assistance was a negotiation as delicate as debt. When she reached the 2nd floor, Mr. Creswell stood outside his office, pinning a notice where every tenant must pass. Final demand. Coal adjustment. Failure to comply invites eviction review. His cuffs were immaculate. His gaze moved over Eleanor as though measuring shelf space. "Miss Chambers," he said, "your account remains unsettled." "My account remains disputed." "Disputes do not warm rooms. Neither do notices." He looked almost entertained. "You have wit for someone in arrears." "I have arithmetic for someone in charge of a ledger." For a breath, his expression flattened into something colder than boredom. Then he smoothed the paper with 2 fingers and stepped aside. "Friday," he said. "No extensions." Elena climbed without haste, because haste pleased men who relied on intimidation to replace law. Inside her room, she untied her bonnet and let herself stand still until the pounding in her temples eased. Then she sat by the window, mended Mrs. Dalrymple's cuff, and kept going until dusk blurred the thread. At 7, she went downstairs to read Mr. Finch's letter by his grate. He had swept his hearth clean to receive her and placed 3 walnuts on a saucer with formal dignity. The letter was from Leeds, full of practical news, and 1 sentence of affection tucked awkwardly at the end. She read it twice. He nodded each time as if hearing scripture, then asked her to fold it back along the old crease and place it in the blue tin beneath his chair. She did. On her way up, she passed the door opposite her own and heard the scrape of a chair, the rustle of paper, then stillness, as if the occupant had paused to listen for her steps. She unlocked her room, set her candle near the washstand, and discovered that the ceiling leak had widened to a dark seam the length of her forearm. Water dripped in steady intervals into the full basin, overflowed, and traced a thin silver line across the floorboards toward her bed. She moved fast. Quilt first, then the milliner's basket, then her father's compass, and the Bible. She set 2 bowls under the worst points and wrung water from the blanket into the slop pail. A drip struck the candle flame hard enough to spit wax onto her knuckles. She hissed, wiped her hand on her skirt, and dragged the chair beneath the crack to inspect it. Plaster sagged like wet bread. This would not hold through the night. She crossed the corridor and knocked twice on the opposite door, because borrowing tools in Hawthorne Row required promptness and no apology. The door opened after a moment, revealing a tall man in shirt sleeves with dark hair still damp from rain, and a coat hanging over one arm as if he had only just come in. His eyes were grey, sharp, observant, and very awake for this hour. Behind him, she glimpsed the porter's trunk, stacked books, and a coil of rope. "Sir," she said, formal from habit, "I require a ladder if you possess one. My ceiling has developed opinions." A brief pause, then the faintest movement at one corner of his mouth. "I do possess one. Julian Vale." "Elena Chambers, I am opposite." "I know." He stepped back, took a folded painter's ladder from beside the trunk, and carried it into the corridor without waiting to be invited. The ease with which he lifted it suggested dock work or military drill, not clerkship. His hands were calloused along the palm, but the nails were clean, trimmed close. Not merely a labourer, something else layered beneath. In her room, he set the ladder under the seam and looked up once, taking in the angle of sagging plaster, the pooled water, the bowls already arranged to catch runoff. "Hold the candle lower," he said. "If the lath has gone soft, heat will not help it." His voice was low and precise. She did as instructed, because competence recognized competence. He climbed 2 rungs, pressed the ceiling near the crack with a gloved thumb, and stopped. "You are right, it will fail if the rain continues." Elena shifted the candle and laughed once, dry as paper. Reassuring. I did not intend reassurance. I intended accuracy. That may be the most honest sentence spoken in this building. He descended, took a narrow knife from his pocket, and carefully opened the plaster seam another inch so water poured directly into the basin rather than along the floor. The stream strengthened, then steadied. Ugly, but controlled. "Elena," she said before she could stop herself, then corrected. "Miss Chambers, thank you." He glanced at her, and in that glance there was a tension without intrusion, as if he catalogued details because details mattered. "Mr. Vale is sufficient." "Then, Mr. Vale, permit me one complaint while we stand knee-deep in architecture. Our landlord collects rent by proxy and repairs by miracle. The miracles arrive late." He was very still for a heartbeat, not offended, listening. "Have you met him?" he asked. "Only in notices." "Then perhaps reserve judgment." "I reserve payment whenever possible. Judgment is free." A softer sound escaped him, almost a laugh, quickly suppressed. He braced the basin with his boot so the overflow would not tip and said, "You should report this in writing. 2 copies. Date both." She stared at him. "You sound like a solicitor." "I sound like a man who has lost arguments to missing paper." That did not answer anything, but it answered enough to be useful. She fetched scrap from her writing stack, and while he held the candle now, she drafted a formal complaint to the steward. Location, damage, risk to bedding, request for immediate repair. He watched the page as she wrote, gaze flicking once to her hand. "Your script is exact," he said. "It must be. I am paid by legibility. Keep 1 copy where no one can claim accident." She thought of her mother's letters under the Bible and nodded. "I already do." When the writing was finished, he carried the ladder back across the landing and returned with a strip of waxed cloth and 2 tacks. Without ceremony, he fixed the cloth above her window to divert a secondary trickle away from the wall, then gathered his tools. At the door, he paused. "There is another matter. Cresswell makes rounds at dawn on Thursdays. Put your complaint under his ledger before 6. He cannot deny receipt if witnesses see it." She narrowed her eyes. "You are new here, Mr. Vale." "I observe quickly." "So I see." He inclined his head, formal as a bow pared down to function. "Good night, Miss Chambers." "Good night." He crossed the corridor and closed his door softly again, as if the building itself were sleeping, and he had no right to wake it. Elena stood in the centre of her narrow room, candle guttering, rain tapping the pane, the redirected stream striking the basin in a hard, regular rhythm. She looked at the complaint in her hand, at the neatness of her own script, at the wet hem of her skirt and the wax cooling on her knuckles. Then she folded 1 copy into her Bible, took the second, and tucked it inside her bodice so she would not forget it at dawn. What Elena did not know, what no one in Hawthorne Row knew, was that the man across the landing had not come to the row in search of cheap rent at all, and that her complaint, spoken with dry fury over a leaking ceiling, had reached the only person in London who could force the walls to answer. She slept in intervals no longer than the cooling of the candle stub, waking each time the basin rang under the redirected stream, and when darkness thinned to ash at the window she rose, dressed in yesterday's skirt, and went down with the folded complaint held dry inside her sleeve. The corridor smelled of wet plaster and boiled oats. On the first landing, Mrs. Pike stood with a shawl pinned crookedly, waiting for the pump queue to move, and Mr. Finch felt his way along the rail by habit. Elena crossed to the steward's office door, lifted the ledger flap, and slid her letter beneath the weight of accounts exactly as Mr. Vale had advised. She did not knock. She stepped back where both tenants could see and said, in an ordinary voice, "I have submitted written notice of structural damage in my room." Mrs. Pike gave a grunt that could have meant anything. "About time someone put it on paper." Mr. Finch angled his head toward Eleanor's voice. "Do you require a witness, miss?" "I do." Then I witnessed. Only then did Eleanor let herself breathe fully. She went to the yard and took her place at the pump. When she lifted the iron handle, she felt, rather than saw, someone come to stand one pace behind and to her left, close enough to take over if the mechanism jammed. She glanced back once. Julian Vale wore the same coarse coat, sleeves turned, collar plain. His hair was still damp from his wash, his expression unreadable. "You are awake early for a new tenant," she said. "I dislike avoidable surprises," he replied. "So do I." He took his turn at the pump without further comment. They carried their pails upstairs in parallel silence, and if anyone noticed the arrangement, no one remarked upon it. By that afternoon, the complaint had produced no repair, only a chalk mark on her doorframe indicating inspection pending. Eleanor completed 2 sets of cuffs for the milliner, copied 6 pages of apothecary entries, and returned at dusk with her fingers cramped and her purse heavier by only 4 pence. The chalk mark remained. The leak persisted in disciplined drops. On the following morning, the building broke its routine. Elena had just reached the middle stair with Mr. Finch's reading spectacles in one hand and her own mending basket in the other, when a heavy thud sounded below, followed by the startled cry of someone too breathless for words. She looked down and saw Mrs. Hargreaves from the ground floor crumpled against the newel post, bonnet half off, one hand twisted in her apron, as though she had tried to catch herself and missed. Tenants gathered in the bad way, crowds gathered in Hawthorne Row, quickly, noisily, and without purpose. Someone called for vinegar. Someone else suggested salt. No one moved toward her. Elena set down her basket and went down fast. Not running, because running on those stairs invited a second casualty. She knelt on the worn boards and touched 2 fingers to Mrs. Hargreaves's wrist. Weak pulse. Skin cold. Breath. Present, but shallow. "Give us room," Eleanor said, clear and flat. "Mrs. Pike, open the yard door. She needs air. Mr. Finch, remain where you are. Do not descend." Mrs. Pike blinked, then obeyed. Elena loosened the older woman's collar and found a narrow cut at the temple where she had struck the rail. Not deep, but bleeding enough to frighten the bystanders into uselessness. Elena looked up once and saw Julian on the landing above, already moving. "Mr. Vale," she said. "Water, clean cloth, now." He was gone before she finished the second noun. She pulled her own handkerchief free, pressed it to the wound, and felt the cloth soak through. Without hesitation, she caught the edge of her underskirt hem, tore a strip free with both hands, and folded it twice into a thicker pad. Her palms shook once from effort, then stilled. Julian returned with a basin and 2 folded rags. He knelt opposite her, placed them within reach, and waited for instruction without filling silence with reassurance. His stillness altered the room more effectively than shouted commands. "Lift her shoulders when I count," Elena said. "1, 2, now." He moved exactly on the third beat. They eased Mrs. Hargreaves against the stair wall where light and air reached her face. Elena rinsed the cloth, cleaned the cut, and tied the strip in place. The older woman's eyelids fluttered. Her breath deepened by increments. "There," Elena said softly. "Stay with me, Mrs. Hargreaves. Do not stand yet." A minute later, the woman opened her eyes and tried to apologize. "You will do no such thing," Elena said. "You will sit." Julian set his hand behind Mrs. Hargreaves's back to steady her and looked at Elena across the narrow space. His eyes were grey in the stairwell light, precise and intent. Not soft, attentive. "Shall I fetch Dr. Benton from Larch Street?" he asked. "Yes. Tell him she fell and struck her temple. Ask for tincture and rest instructions." He nodded and rose. Before he turned, he said, "Miss Chambers." Only that. Yet the formality held weight. Not a courtesy thrown to smooth class edges, but acknowledgement of authority she had not requested, and he had not resisted. After he left, the bystanders found their voices again. Mrs. Pike muttered that she had always said the third stair was cursed. A hall boy offered opinions about fainting ladies he could not possibly possess. Elena ignored them and kept pressure on the bandage until Dr. Benton arrived, breathless and irritable from the climb, then less irritable when he saw the wound already cleaned and secured. "Who tied this?" he asked. "I did." He gave a curt nod. "You tied it properly." Mrs. Hargreaves was settled back into her room with broth, instructions, and strict orders not to carry coal scuttles unassisted. By the time Eleanor climbed to her own floor, her torn hem dragged unevenly, and the mending basket still sat where she had dropped it. Julian waited in the corridor outside his door, hat in hand as if he had paused there by accident and could not make the pretense convincing. "Doctor, Benton says she will recover," he said. "I heard." His gaze dropped to the ragged line of Elena's skirt. "You sacrifice fabric." "It was old fabric." "Even so." Elena shifted the basket to her other arm. "In Hawthorne Row, cloth is cheaper than funerals." A breath of something passed over his face, almost amusement, quickly replaced by reserve. A practical principle. "The only kind that survives here." He inclined his head. "Then I shall adopt it." She gave the smallest shrug, because the exchange had gone dangerously close to warmth, and warmth could not be entered like a room she owned. "Good day, Mr. Vale." "Good day, Miss Chambers." Inside her room, she sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her hands. A faint rust mark from the stair rail marked her right palm. Her left thumb bore a crescent of dried blood that was not hers. She washed both in cold water and went back to work. At dawn the next day, the pump handle stuck again on the first lift. Elena leaned her weight into it and felt the iron refuse, then shudder. Before she could try a second time, Julian stepped forward, set down his pail, and crouched by the hinge pin. He asked Mrs. Pike for lamp oil, drew a narrow tool from his pocket, and worked the seized joint with patient pressure while mud soaked through one knee of his trousers. Mr. Talbot the cobbler shuffled over, already sharpening a complaint. Tenants should not tamper with landlord equipment. Julian looked up once, then informed management it has been done. Mr. Talbot fell silent at once, as if he had been answered by someone accustomed to being obeyed. Water ran clean on the next stroke. The queue advanced with unusual quiet. Later that same day, Elena paused on St. James's Church steps after delivering collars to a client near Piccadilly. Afternoon light lay pale across the stone. Wheels and hooves moved in a measured clatter below. Julian stood near the rail to let a charwoman pass with her basket, then offered Elena a folded paper without preamble. "You dropped this on Larch Street," he said. She recognized the scrap as a copied inventory list from the apothecary, columns of numbers she had thought lost. "Thank you. I had resigned myself to rewriting." "Do you resign often?" "Only to arithmetic and weather." His mouth shifted almost into a smile and stopped before arriving. Sensibly selected adversaries. When she took the page, her fingers brushed his glove. The contact lasted less than a second and unsettled her out of proportion. She told herself it was surprise. She descended the steps before that explanation could be tested. That evening, while reading invoices aloud to Mr. Finch by his low fire, she heard hammering in the corridor overhead. Measured strikes, pauses, then 2 strikes together. Banister repair. She finished the 3rd page, folded the account sheet, and climbed to find Julian replacing a warped spindle outside the 2nd floor turn. "You have acquired a new profession," she said. He set the chisel down and tested the rail with his weight. "Only a temporary appointment." "Unpaid?" He glanced at her. "All useful work is paid, not always in coin." "Then I hope Hawthorne Row is generous." "It is educational." She should have left then. Instead, she held Mr. Finch's folded accounts against her skirts and remained, while Julian drove the last nail flush and smoothed the splintered edge with sandpaper he had cut to fit his hand. Not the haste of a tenant fixing what annoyed him, the care of someone restoring what he considered his responsibility. The following morning, a carrier arrived with a parcel too fine for Hawthorne Row, addressed in a clerk's script to J. Vale. The boy demanded immediate signature and looked prepared to argue when Julian reached for the pen. Elena happened to be crossing the landing with clean linen for Mrs. Hargreaves and paused when she saw him write. His hand moved in rapid, elegant strokes, the capitals balanced, the line firm. Educated at a level no dock porter possessed. Julian folded the receipt and passed the boy a coin. As he turned, the cuff of his sleeve shifted and Elena glimpsed the edge of a seal ring on a black cord around his neck, tucked beneath his shirt as if deliberately hidden. He noticed her notice, and his hand went to the cord in one unbroken motion, drawing it out of sight. "A delivery error," he said. "I did not ask." "No." She held his gaze for a beat, then continued to the stair. She did not ask because questions invited answers and answers created obligations. By dusk, she returned from Larch Street to find 2 carpenters in the yard unloading timber where the broken 3rd stair had been roped off for months. Mr. Creswell stood nearby with his ledger closed, expression pinched. Julian spoke to the foreman in low tones Elena could not fully hear, except for one sentence. "You will begin tonight." The foreman nodded with immediate compliance and signalled his men without haggling over price or schedule. When Creswell saw Eleanor watching, he performed a smile that never reached his eyes. "At last, Miss Chambers, your collective complaints have produced movement." "Our collective complaints have existed for months," Elena said. "Then timing is a mystery solved by men above your acquaintance." Julian turned his head slightly at that, not enough to claim intervention, not little enough to miss the insult. Elena met Creswell's gaze and replied with 4 words. "So is basic decency." She went upstairs before he could answer. Near midnight, unable to sleep for the scrape of saw and hammer below, she stepped into the corridor for air and found Julian by the landing window, coat off, shirt sleeves rolled, watching the work in the yard as if taking inventory. Lantern light cut his profile into hard lines. There was fatigue there and something more controlled than anger. "You are not required to supervise," she said quietly. "Neither are you." "I live above the noise. I live beside it." She rested one hand on the cold sill. Do you always answer a statement with another statement? Only when the first is accurate. For a moment the corner of his mouth lifted. He smiled then, briefly, and the change was startling. Reserve giving way to warmth so direct it altered him, as if he had stepped from shadow into open day. Then the expression passed, and he was Mr. Vale again. Plain coat, measured voice. Mrs. Hargreaves asked after you, Elena said, because the alternative was naming what had just happened. She intends to return your basin tomorrow. She may keep it. She will not. No, he said, and now there was unmistakable humour in it. She will not. The carpenters below finished one section of stair and moved to the next. Elena listened to the ring of metal settling into wood and felt an unfamiliar sensation ease beneath her ribs. Not trust, not yet, but the outline of it. At breakfast the following morning, Mrs. Pike announced to anyone within hearing that Hawthorne Row had become fashionable enough for miracles. Mr. Finch asked whether the repaired rail would hold a man of his age and temper. Mrs. Hargreaves declared that Miss Chambers had saved her from widowhood's indignities by refusing to let her die in the stairwell like forgotten luggage. Elena accepted none of the praise and corrected all exaggerations. Julian said little. He carried coal to Mrs. Dalrymple's hearth when her shoulder failed, returned a dropped parcel to the baker's wife at the gate, and took down the old warning rope from the stair only after testing each tread twice. The day moved. Work waited. Bills remained unsoftened by improved timber. Yet by evening, when Eleanor sat by her candle finishing buttonholes and heard Julian's step pause once outside her door before crossing to his own, she no longer heard only caution in that pause. She heard recognition, almost deniable and therefore safer, moving through the narrow corridor between their rooms, like a current neither of them acknowledged, and neither could entirely refuse. The corridor fell quiet after his door closed, yet Elena remained with her needle suspended above the cuff in her lap, listening to the silence as if it had altered shape. Then she set the work aside, banked the candle, and lay down fully clothed. Sleep came in short intervals, broken by water settling in the basin and by the memory of his smile, brief and disarming, returning at inopportune moments like a tune she had not chosen. At dawn she found Mrs. Dalrymple on the landing outside the ground-floor front room, one hand pressed to her side and the other braced against the wall where plaster had flaked away in pale curls. The seamstress's eyes were rimmed red from a night spent coughing beside a cold grate. "I have 3 mourning bodices due by Thursday," Mrs. Dalrymple said, as if presenting a legal argument. "My fingers do not bend when the room goes this cold." Eleanor shifted her pail to the opposite hand. "Have you asked Cresswell for your coal allotment?" "I asked. He said account review." "Account review is what he says before he says no." The older woman drew herself upright with visible effort, embarrassed by what weakness had shown. "I shall manage." Elena looked at the seamstress's hands, needle-pricked, swollen at the joints, wrapped in strips of old muslin where the skin had split. "You should not have to manage frost in September." "In Hawthorne Row," Mrs. Dalrymple said with dry precision, "should and must are distant cousins." She went inside before Eleanor could answer. The door latched gently, not in rejection, but in habit, the sound of a woman who had learned to hide difficulty before witnesses could name it. By mid-morning, Mr. Finch's cough had worsened enough that each breath seemed negotiated. Elena sat by his grate reading from the shipping reports he preferred, pausing when his chest tightened, waiting while he found air again. Dr. Benton had left a powder weeks ago, long exhausted. The blue tin under Mr. Finch's chair contained 2 walnuts, 3 buttons, and 1 farthing. "I shall read the rest this evening," Elena said, folding the newspaper. "No, miss, continue. The Baltic figures improve my constitution." "The Baltic cannot repair your lungs." He gave a thin smile toward her voice. "Pity. I have always admired efficiency." When she left him, Julian stood in the courtyard speaking to the timber merchant who had supplied the stair repairs. Their conversation was low and practical. The merchant, a man known for arguing over halfpence, nodded at Julian without resistance and tipped his hat before retreating to his cart. As Elena crossed toward the gate, Julian turned. "Miss Chambers." "Mr. Vale." His coat was plain, cuffs worn at the edges, but today a dark smear of ink marked his left thumb and the side of his hand, as if he had been writing for hours. She noticed, too, that the postboy lingered by the corner waiting for him. Julian took a sealed envelope from his inner pocket and passed it over with 2 coins. "Same address," he said. The boy glanced at the script and tucked the letter into his satchel with uncommon care. "Yes, sir." "Sir." The word passed quickly, nearly swallowed by the rattle of a passing dray, but Elena heard it. Julian seemed to register that she had heard. His expression did not change. "You are out early." "I am going to Larch Street." He inclined his head. "Take the east pavement. There is paving work near the square." Practical, measured, and already stepping back. Eleanor returned the nod and continued through the gate, telling herself that whatever he posted and wherever he sent it belonged to his private ledger, not hers. Cold arrived in earnest after sundown, and every errand acquired urgency. Elena delivered finished cuffs to the milliner, copied invoices at the apothecary until her wrist cramped, and stood 2 extra hours sorting damaged ribbon lengths for half pay, because refusal would have meant no pay at all. When she counted her coins beneath a warehouse eave out of the wind, the sum was enough for her own rent deficiency if she skipped supper for 3 nights. Not enough for coal, not enough for medicine, certainly not enough for both. She walked instead to Camden Passage, to the narrow pawnbroker with the green-shaded lamp and brass scale, and laid her father's cameo brooch on the velvet pad between them. The broker turned it once, held it near the light, and named a number that made her jaw tighten. "It is carved shell, not glass," she said. "I did not call it glass. It is set in gold, thin gold. It belonged to my father." The broker's eyes remained on the scale. "Sentiment raises no market value, miss." She held his gaze until he added 1 sovereign and 6pence, not from generosity, but from respect for resistance that did not plead. Elena nodded once. The cameo vanished into tissue and drawerwood with a sound softer than she expected and more final. Outside, she stood in the press of evening traffic with the coins in her glove and felt the shape of the absent brooch like a missing tooth. Then she turned back toward Hawthorne Row and began spending the money before grief could render her foolish. 2 sacks of coal on account to Mrs. Dalrymple's room, paid in advance and marked as overage correction so the gift could pass as bureaucracy. 1 bottle of cough tincture and 1 packet of mustard plasters from Dr. Benton for Mr. Finch, settled in cash with instructions that the old man's pride be spared if possible. "You are buying half my shelf," Dr. Benton said, wrapping the parcels. "For yourself?" "For a household epidemic of obstinacy." He snorted, then lowered his voice. "I can note this as community reserve. Less embarrassing for him." "Thank you." When she reached Hawthorne Row, the steward had pinned fresh arrears notices at the office door. Names marched down the page in blunt ink, including her own and, 3 lines below, J. Vale, 2 weeks outstanding. She stood still long enough to read the sum twice. It was not large, but it was enough for Cresswell to harass publicly. Enough for leverage in a building where leverage was the only recognized currency. Julian emerged from the stairwell carrying a toolbox and nodded to her as he passed, unaware she had been studying the list. "Miss Chambers? Mr. Vale?" He continued to the upper landing without pause. Eleanor watched him go, saw the careful way he favoured his right shoulder as if an old injury had stiffened in the cold, and thought of the envelope handed to the postboy with the words, "Same address." Wages sent elsewhere. Rent left exposed. Not careless, prioritised. She turned into the steward's office before she could revise the decision into caution. Cresswell sat at the desk with his ledger open and his watch chain bright against his waistcoat. "Miss Chambers," he said, "if you have come to dispute totals, I advise brevity. I have come to settle an account." "That would be novel." She placed coins on the blotter and named the amount beside J. Vale's line. Cresswell's brows lifted by a fractional degree. "You are authorized to act for Mr. Vale. I am authorized to spend my own money badly. Enter it as paid." He tapped one coin with his fingernail. "Shall I inform him of his benefactor?" "No. That creates complications. So does eviction." For the first time, his boredom thinned into curiosity. "Your floor has become unusually charitable." "Record the payment, Mr. Cresswell." He wrote, sanded the line, and tore a narrow receipt from his pad. Elena took it before he could annotate the margin and folded it into her glove. As she reached the door, Cresswell said, "Miss Chambers, your own arrears remain." She did not turn. "I am acquainted with my own arrears." In her room, she opened the Bible on the washstand to the Psalms, where her mother's letters lay in exact quarters, slid the receipt between those pages, and closed the cover with both palms flat, as if pressing a wound closed. Then she carried the medicine to Mr. Finch and told him, "Doctor, Benton had revised treatment protocol for all older tenants because of damp season conditions." Mr. Finch accepted this fiction with grave gratitude and did not ask who had paid. Mrs. Dalrymple discovered the coal delivery at twilight and appeared on Elena's threshold with soot on her cuffs and suspicion in her face. "Cresswell says there was an overcharge correction." "There should have been." "He says you filed the dispute." Elena kept one hand on the doorframe. "Then I suppose even ledgers can improve." The seamstress looked at her for a long moment, understanding too much and choosing dignity over thanks. "If ever you require sleeve alterations, I charge friends less." "I will remember." That night, as Elena stitched by candlelight, footsteps paused outside her door in the now familiar way. She expected them to pass. Instead, there came a quiet knock. Julian stood in the corridor with a folded newspaper and a strip of sandpaper in his hand, as if he had intended one errand and chosen another. "Mr. Finch asked whether you had finished the Baltic report. He threatened to perish if deprived of shipping data." "He has made that threat before." Julian's eyes, clear grey in the low light, held hers a second too long. "He also said Dr. Benton's new regimen arrived with impeccable timing." Eleanor kept her expression neutral. "How fortunate for him." "How fortunate," Julian repeated. Something unspoken moved between them. Not accusation, not gratitude, only recognition sharpened by restraint. He gave a slight nod and stepped back. "Good night, Miss Chambers." "Good night, Mr. Vale." When his door closed, she sat again, took one careful breath, and resumed stitching. Her thumb bled once where the needle slipped. She wrapped it in thread and continued. With rain beginning again in thin diagonal lines across the courtyard, Elena stood outside the steward's office holding an envelope containing her rent payment and a half-crown toward coal. She had earned it by finishing an emergency order of black ribbon rosettes through 2 nights without proper sleep. Her shoulders ached. Her fingers felt carved from wood, yet the envelope was warm in her palm from being held too tightly, and warmth counted. The office door stood nearly shut, not latched. Voices carried through the narrow gap. Beatrice Chambers spoke first, unmistakable even after weeks apart. Low, controlled, the consonants clipped with commercial precision. "Raise Miss Chambers's rent again. Deprivation corrects romantic delusion." Elena stopped as if the floor had shifted beneath her shoes. The corridor narrowed. The envelope edge pressed into the center of her hand until pain sparked. Cresswell answered in his smoothing tone. "A second increase this quarter invites complaint. Then call it fuel recalibration. Your creativity has served before." A chair scraped. Elena could not move. Her mother was here in this building, negotiating pressure as if ordering silk bolts by the yard. Then Julian's voice from inside the same room, steady and unreadable. "Proceed with formal notices." The envelope slid from Eleanor's fingers and struck the runner with a soft paper sound that seemed far louder than it was. No one inside paused. Conversation resumed in blurred fragments she no longer processed. Romantic delusion. Proceed. Her hands had gone numb to the wrist. She bent, retrieved the envelope by habit alone, and stepped backward until the wall met her shoulder blades. Breath came shallow and quick, then thin, as if the corridor had spent its air. She turned and walked, not quickly, not slowly, one measured step after another down the passage and up the stair. Her face composed because composure was the last possession no one had yet managed to invoice. Inside her room, she closed the door with care and set the envelope on the washstand beside the Bible. Rain ticked at the pane. Water tapped into the basin from the seam that repairs had reduced, but not cured. Her fingers left faint, damp prints on the wood where she braced herself. She did not cry. Her throat burned as if she had swallowed smoke, and a fine tremor ran through both hands until she clasped them together hard enough to stop it. She looked at the Bible, at the hidden receipt for his rent, at her mother's folded commands beneath it, and understood how neatly she had mistaken proximity for alliance. Not kindness, surveillance, not recognition. Use. She stood there until the trembling settled into stillness. Then she crossed to the bed, knelt, and drew the carpet-bag from beneath the frame. She pulled the carpet-bag into the narrow strip of dry floor between bed and washstand, and opened it with both hands, as if beginning ordinary travel rather than severance. The room looked smaller with the bag unlatched. One chemise, then the second. Wool stockings rolled tight, her spare collar wrapped in clean paper. She reached for the Bible, paused, and opened it first to the pages where her mother's letters lay beside the steward's receipt for Julian's rent, then slid all three papers into the inside pocket of the bag without rereading a word. Her father's compass followed, its needle still wandering east of true. She added the last of her coins, counted once, and shut the clasp. On the sill above the washstand, the brass key from Kensington caught the candlelight, exactly as it had on her first night in Hawthorne Row. It was warm when she closed her fist around it, warm from the room, not from belonging. A soft knock sounded at her door. Not Cresswell's brisk authority, not Mrs. Pike's blunt rap. Julian's measured rhythm, 2 strikes and silence. "Elena," he said through the wood, formal even now. "Miss Chambers, are you awake?" She did not answer. Her throat worked once against the words and refused them. The handle shifted very slightly, then stilled. After a moment, his steps retreated across the landing, and his own door closed. She lifted the carpet-bag, blew out the candle, and left. The street outside had gone to slick black stone under steady rain, lamplight fractured in every rut. Elena walked to Kensington without hiring a cab, because every shilling had purpose and because she required the distance to cool the heat behind her ribs. By the time she turned into her mother's square, her hem was soaked to the knee, and the seams of her gloves had darkened with water. The Chambers townhouse stood as immaculate as ever, fanlight polished, brass plate bright, curtains set in exact folds that gave no hint of the negotiations conducted behind them. The footman who opened the door recognized her at once and tried, for one uneasy second, to place her in the old hierarchy. "Ms. Elena, Mrs. Chambers is not receiving—" "I am not calling," Elena said. "I am concluding." She stepped past him before he chose obedience and crossed the marble hall, with rain still dripping from her cuffs. The drawing-room doors stood half open. Beatrice Chambers sat near the fire with correspondence spread in geometric order across the low table, pearls at her throat, posture untouched by the late hour. She looked up once as Elena entered, took in wet skirts, travel bag, uninvited arrival, and returned her attention to the page in hand. "You have come to your senses," Beatrice said. "At last." Elena shut the door behind her and did not remove her gloves. "No." Beatrice set down her letter with care. "Then you have come to negotiate?" "No." A slight pause. "You are in no position to refuse terms." Elena crossed to the writing desk, placed the brass house key on the polished wood, and laid her mother's letters beside it, edges aligned. She then set down one more folded paper, the offer of a governess post on heavy cream stock, obtained a week earlier through the vicar's wife on Larch Street, and kept unanswered until this hour because she had still been deciding whether endurance and hope were the same thing. "I accepted this position tonight," she said. "Mrs. Ellison of Kent, 2 girls, ages 9 and 11. Board, salary, and no supervisory recommendations required from family." Beatrice's eyes, pale and exact, moved over the paper and back to Elena's face. "You would exchange your name for wages in a nursery. I would exchange control for work. You are dramatizing inconvenience. You raised my rent through your ally and called it correction." For the first time, a narrow line appeared between Beatrice's brows. "You were never meant to hear administrative language. Administrative language does not bruise less because it is tidy." Beatrice stood then, silk whispering across carpet. "Lord Ashford remains willing to overlook this episode. You will apologize, dress properly, and attend supper Thursday. I shall restore your allowance on receipt of your compliance." Elena lifted her carpet bag onto the nearest chair and straightened the strap. "I do not require restoration. You cannot survive on principle. I am surviving now. On scraps. On my own scraps." The fire shifted behind the grate with a low metallic tick. Somewhere in the hall a clock struck once past midnight. Beatrice studied her daughter's face as if searching for evidence of maneuver rather than conviction. "You are making yourself socially unfit," she said at last. "No household of consequence receives a woman who has publicly defied her family." Eleanor met her gaze and answered in 4 words. "Then I shall teach." Beatrice's mouth tightened by a degree. "If you walk out tonight, do not return expecting revision." "I expect nothing." She lifted the bag again. At the threshold she paused, not from uncertainty, but to complete the ledger of what was owed and what was finished. "My father's trust was not yours to weaponize," she said without turning. "If you contest me further, keep your letters. I have copies." Behind her, Beatrice said Elena's name as if it were a failed investment. Elena opened the door and left before the sentence could continue. The rain had eased to a fine mist by the time she reached the coaching yard near Charing Cross, where lamps burned low and ostlers moved among horses with practical impatience. She paid for a seat on the 6 o'clock coach to Kent and took the ticket with fingers that no longer trembled. In the waiting room, she sat upright on a hard bench with her bag at her feet and watched steam rise from wet wool coats. No one looked at anyone for long in places of departure. 3 hours passed before first light whitened the edges of the yard gates. Eleanor did not sleep. She ate half a heel of bread from her pocket, drank weak tea gone almost cold, and checked her ticket twice by habit, as if paper could anchor what choice had already set in motion. At 10 minutes before departure, she stepped into the yard for air and saw him. Julian stood just beyond the lamp circle in a plain black coat, hat in hand, rain-dark hair brushed back from his forehead. He looked as he always had in Hawthorne Row, and not at all as he had looked there, because context had shifted and carried him with it. 2 men waited near the gate behind him, soberly dressed, each holding document cases sealed in red wax. Eleanor did not move toward him. He came to her and stopped at a respectful distance. "I asked the clerk to delay your coach by 5 minutes," he said. "No longer." She held the ticket inside her glove so tightly the paper edge pressed her palm. "You should not have followed me." "I came to correct harm I helped cause. Harm does not become smaller by grammar." "No." His voice remained level. "But facts matter." She looked at him in full daylight and saw, with a cold clarity, all the details she had shelved because they did not fit. The handwriting too educated for his claimed station, tradesmen answering him without bargaining, instructions delivered as if accustomed to compliance, the ring hidden on a cord. "Then state your facts, Mr. Vale." He did not flinch at the name she chose. "My name is Theodore Vale, Viscount Marbridge. I own Hawthorne Row and serve as co-trustee of your father's settlement." For one suspended second, the yard noise thinned to hoof stamps and leather creak at great distance. Elena heard again, as if through the steward's half-closed door, his voice saying "proceed" with formal notices, and the sentence split cleanly into what she had feared and what he now claimed. He continued, measured and quiet. "The notices were drafted against Cresswell for fraud, and against any party who directed illegal pressure on tenants, including your mother. I kept my identity hidden to gather signed evidence before intervention." She stared at him, then at the men by the gate with their sealed cases, then back. "You sat in that room while she spoke of deprivation." "I did. If I interrupted, she would deny and leave. I needed witnesses and her own words on record. And I was to trust silence." "You were not asked to trust. You were observed, and I acknowledge the injury in that." The candor landed harder than apology. Elena felt anger rise, sharp and clean, then alter into something more complicated and more difficult to carry. "You might have told me," she said. "I could not, without compromising prosecution." He glanced once toward the gate, then back to her. "I should have warned you after. I did not move quickly enough." One of the men approached and offered a packet. Theodore took it and extended it to Eleanor. Inside, beneath the outer fold, she saw copies of ledgers, affidavits from tenants, and her mother's letters in duplicate script, each marked for court submission. Her own complaint about the ceiling sat among them, dated and countersigned by 2 witnesses exactly as instructed. Her receipt for Julian's rent appeared as well, entered in the steward's hand and circled in ink as proof of manipulated arrears accounting across floors. "What is this outcome?" she asked. "Cresswell is removed as of this morning. Proceedings begin this week. Your allowance cannot be suspended unilaterally under your father's trust deed. The court will restore direct disbursement under independent oversight. You are free to take Kent, return to Hawthorne Row, or refuse both. No one will control that decision again. No flourish, no plea. The revelation was administrative in form and seismic in consequence. The coachman called for boarding. Elena looked at the open coach door, then at the packet in her hands, then at Theodore, who waited without reaching for her bag or her answer. His eyes were grey as ever, but no longer unreadable. There was fatigue there and restraint and a steadiness that did not attempt to purchase forgiveness. She placed her ticket on the bench rail between them. "I will still go to Kent." He inclined his head once. "That is reasonable. For one term," she added. "I decide what comes after." Yes. She drew breath that felt, for the first time in months, entirely her own. "Send all legal notices to Mrs. Ellison's address, not to my mother, not to Hawthorne Row." "I will." The second boarding call sounded sharper. Eleanor lifted her carpet bag. Theodore stepped aside, giving her clear passage to the coach steps. As she set her foot on the iron rung, he spoke once more, low enough that only she could hear. "Miss Chambers." She looked back. "I saw what you did there," he said. "For Mrs. Hargreaves, for Finch, for people no ledger counted. That was why I noticed you before any of this." The words did not ask for absolution. They acknowledged a truth she had paid for. Elena held his gaze, then gave the smallest nod. "Then count accurately, Lord Marbridge." She entered the coach without haste, set her bag beside her knees, and kept her spine straight as the wheels began to turn, and London opened before her. Not as exile this time, but as a road chosen under her own name. The coach rocked through the city gates and into the long grey of morning, and Elena kept her gloved hand over the packet of papers in her lap until the wax warmth faded and the seal edges cooled against her skin. She did not open it on the road. She watched hedgerows unspool beyond the clouded glass and counted each mile as a fact, not a feeling. Mrs. Ellison's house in Kent stood at the end of a chalk lane bordered by yew, modest but orderly, with schoolroom windows facing east and a kitchen garden already turned for winter. Elena was shown not to an attic corner but to a narrow chamber with a writing desk, a washstand free of cracks, and a hearth that drew properly when the maid lit it. The youngest girl, Harriet, stared at her from the doorway with solemn hazel eyes and ink on her cuff. The elder, Louisa, asked in one breath whether Miss Chambers knew French verbs, and whether London truly had streets paved in gold. "It has streets paved in mud," Elena answered. "And yes, I know the verbs." The girls accepted her at once. By the first week of December, the schoolroom had found its rhythm. Latin roots before breakfast, penmanship after, geography by the globe in the corner whose equator had been repaired with thread. Elena taught, corrected, listened, and slept through the night for the first time in months. She still woke before dawn by habit, expecting the pump cue and the corridor coughs, then remembered where she was and sat for 1 minute in the dark before rising. The letter from Marbridge House arrived on a clear morning edged with frost. The servant brought it on a tray because Mrs. Ellison's rules required formality, even for unpleasant correspondence. Elena broke the seal in the small morning room while Mrs. Ellison sorted lesson slates nearby and pretended not to read over her shoulder. "Miss Chambers, as requested, notices were sent to your Kent address only." The magistrate accepted affidavits from 6 tenants, Dr. Benton and Mr. Finch, whose statement was witnessed and read aloud at his insistence. Mr. Cresswell's ledgers were seized yesterday. Interim authority over Hawthorne Row has been transferred. The Chancery Clerk requires your signature on 2 original documents, the Trust Disbursement Order and your formal complaint exhibit. If you consent, a carriage will call on Thursday at 11. Respectfully, Theodore Marbridge, no ornament. No attempt at intimacy. The restraint steadied her. Mrs. Ellison set down a slate and said, without looking up, You may take Thursday. Louisa declines my verbs and requires your disapproval to remain civilized, but she will survive one day. Thank you. Mrs. Ellison's mouth curved faintly. I did not thank men when I was widowed at 28 and told to remarry quickly for management. You are not obliged either. On Thursday, Elena rode back to London in a hired carriage with her Bible, her father's compass, and the remaining originals in a leather folio on her knees. Chancery smelled of damp wool, sealing wax, and old paper. The clerk who greeted her was brisk, spectacled, and entirely unimpressed by titles. Miss Chambers, initial here, sign here, and confirm this is your hand on the copy submitted to Hawthorne Row Steward. It is. He blotted the page, sanded it, and passed the next. Trust disbursement, quarterly allowance to be remitted directly to Miss Elena Chambers under independent trustee administration. Mrs. Beatrice Chambers has no discretionary suspension rights. Elena signed. At the far table, Theodore stood in dark morning dress, speaking quietly with counsel. He did not approach until the clerk had finished with her. When he did, he stopped at the proper distance and inclined his head, the same measured courtesy he had offered on a leaking landing in Hawthorne Row. Miss Chambers, my lord, Mr. Cresswell has petitioned for leniency. It was refused. On what grounds? Patent fraud, coercive rent inflation, and falsified maintenance charges. A pause. Your receipt was material evidence. The slip she had hidden in her Bible, accounted for, used. Before she could answer, another party entered the chamber. Beatrice Chambers wore dove-grey silk and a hat pinned with restrained perfection, as if precision could still command outcome. She saw Eleanor, then Theodore, and her gaze sharpened into something colder than surprise. The magistrate's reader called the matter. Affidavits were summarized, then selected lines read aloud. Elena heard her own complaint about the ceiling seam. She heard Dr. Benton's statement on untreated hazards. She heard in unemotional clerk's cadence the sentence Beatrice had spoken in Cresswell's office. Raise Miss Chambers's rent again. Deprivation corrects romantic delusion. The words sounded smaller in record than they had in the corridor, and more ruinous. Beatrice did not look at Elena while they were read. When the order was pronounced, it came in plain legal terms. Cresswell dismissed and charged. Restitution schedule for over-collected rents. Trustee powers constrained by court oversight. Harassment by financial manipulation entered as actionable misconduct. Elena felt no triumph flash through her. What came was steadier. Space, at last, where pressure had been. Outside on the stone steps, Beatrice paused beside her daughter without turning fully. You have made this public, she said. You made it habitual, Elena replied. Beatrice's jaw tightened, then settled. You will discover that autonomy is expensive. I already have. For a fraction of a second, Beatrice seemed about to continue, the old unfinished sentence gathering behind her eyes. She did not. She stepped into her carriage and was gone. Whatever she might have said remained unsaid and, Eleanor understood, would remain so. Theodore descended the steps after the carriage rolled away. He held a small wrapped parcel. Before you return to Kent, he said, there is one item you may want back. Accept or decline as you choose. Elena took the parcel, unfolded the paper, and found her father's cameo brooch, shell profile intact, gold rim dull but unbroken. The pawnbroker's tag was tied to it with string. How? I asked my steward to review tenant pledges made during Cresswell's surcharge period. Items sold under coercive arrears were repurchased where possible from restitution funds, then matched to owners by description. Not a personal gift, a correction in the ledger. She closed her fingers around the cameo. Then it is properly returned. It is. Snow came and went twice before term ended. Elena remained in Kent through Epiphany and into Lent, because she had given her word to the Ellison girls, and because work chosen freely required completion, not dramatic exit. On her final morning there, Louisa slipped a folded sheet into Eleanor's satchel, a list of irregular French verbs written with uncommon care. Harriet presented a sketch of the schoolroom globe with the equator thread drawn in red ink. "You will visit," Harriet said, making it an instruction, "if invited." "You are invited forever," Louisa declared, then blushed at her own certainty. In late April, Elena stepped through the rebuilt gate of Hawthorne Row and heard no drip from broken gutters, no dangerous groan from the third stair. The courtyard had been levelled and repaved. Window seams were tarred. New handrails shone pale where varnish had not yet darkened. A board stood by the pump with neatly written notices for maintenance schedules and tenant meetings, each signed by the temporary trust office. And, below the board, in fresh paint, Hawthorne Relief Fund, Director, Miss Elena Chambers. Mrs. Pike saw her first and halted mid-lecture to a porter. "Well," she said, eyes bright despite the severe line of her mouth, "our unsuitable lady has returned with authority." Mrs. Dalrymple emerged from the ground-floor room with chalk on her sleeve and new spectacles perched low. "Do not stand in the gate, Miss Chambers. You block progress." It was welcome in Hawthorne Row language. Mr. Finch stood near the sunniest wall, cane in one hand, blue tin in the other. His cough had softened to an occasional rasp. "Miss Chambers," he said, turning his clouded eyes toward her voice, "I have been told we now possess regulations. It is deeply unsettling." "You may submit complaints in duplicate," Elena said. "Then civilization survives." That afternoon she sat at a long table set in the courtyard and distributed the first set of keys from the relief fund allotment. 2 rooms held for widows at controlled rent, 1 warm ground-floor chamber reserved for elderly tenants with medical notes attached, emergency coal vouchers recorded against transparent accounts anyone could inspect. Each key was tagged and signed for. No miracles. Systems. When the line had shortened and the ledger lay open to the last entry, Theodore waited a few paces away. No gloves, no hat, coat plain despite the crest on the carriage that had brought him. He had chosen, Elena saw, to stand where every tenant could see him waiting while she worked. At sunset, only 1 key remained on the table. Elena closed the ledger, sanded the final line and looked up. Lord Marbridge. Elena. The title between them had shifted before either acknowledged it. "You have fulfilled every filed obligation," she said. "Repairs, restitution, trusteeship correction, transparent accounts. Even the pump hinge." He gave a brief nod. "I had excellent instruction on documentation." Dry humour, offered carefully. She almost smiled. The courtyard had emptied enough that their voices carried without privacy and without performance. Theodore's gaze held hers, steady and unguarded now, in a way she had never seen across the landing. "When you left for Kent," he said, "you chose with full knowledge of cost. I respected it then. I respect it now. I will not ask for gratitude for doing what law and decency required." He paused once, then continued, quieter. "I am asking one question only. Now that your income is your own, your work is your own, and your choices are not under anyone's hand, would you choose me?" No flourish, no pressure. A question placed on the table as plainly as a key. Elena felt the weight of the cameo at her throat, newly pinned. Felt the compass in her pocket, repaired by an instrument maker at Mr. Finch's insistence last week, its needle finally finding north and holding there. Around them, Hawthorne Row carried on. A pan set down, a window opened, Mrs. Pike instructing someone about proper coal stacking with martial conviction. The place that had watched her diminish now watched her decide. She stepped from behind the table and stood beside him. Not behind, not opposite. "Yes, Theodore," she said. "I would." He smiled once. It transformed his face from disciplined reserve to unmistakable warmth. And because nothing in him rushed, the moment did not either. He offered his arm. She took it. Together they turned back toward the courtyard table where one final key waited to be entered in a ledger that would remain open and accurate under her hand.